can you mix discus from different sources? This is probably one of the bigger questions that we have in the hobby, and in this video I'm not going to provide a definitive yes or no question, but I'm going to share with my experience of keeping and mixing different types of discus from different sources for quite a lot of years. As far as I know, to the best of my knowledge, this issue is specific to discus, so I'm not aware if there's any scientific literature dealing with this question. There's of course a lot of anecdotal evidence in discus forums, online, on YouTube in general, so there's also lots of opinions in the hobby on this issue. That's why everything that I'm going to say is not going to be based on any sort of scientific evidence. Alright, so for those of you not familiar with the issue, I will briefly talk about the problem. So what seems to be the problem? There are generally two camps in the hobby, two groups of people. The first group would say that it's absolutely fine to mix discus fish from different sources. That is, to mix wild discus, Asian discus and European bred discus, and there's no problem with that at all. You need to obey the proper quarantine procedures and everything will be fine. Then there's also a second group of people which is also mostly driven quite a few major discus breeders, particularly by Standcare, which is certainly the largest discus breeding company or farm in Europe, and pretty much probably one of the largest in the world. So what these people are saying is that discus from different sources carry different pathogens, so they have no immunity against pathogens developed by discus from a different source. So when you combine this discus from different sources, no matter how long you quarantine them, it is likely that their immunity will be affected, and it is likely that they will get some sort of disease, and that will be the end of your discus collection. So let's get to the bottom of this issue. Usually we talk about three different sources of discus: wild discus, that is a discus caught from the nature, Asian bred discus and European bred discus. So let's start with wild discus. I can say for sure with 100% of certainty that you can mix wild discus from different sources, from different catch locations, also different species of discus. For example, you can mix hackles with brown discus, with blue discus and with green discus, provided that you apply proper quarantine procedures. There's absolutely no problem with mixing different types, different species, different color variations of wild discus. I have done it many times, lots of other aquarists have done it, and most importantly, discus importers are usually doing that in their holding tanks, so they would mix different species of discus or discus from different catch locations. There's absolutely no problem with that. Alright, with this issue solved, let's move to the next category, Asian discus. I actually don't like this term Asian discus, because the fish that we call Asian discus actually comes from a variety of countries and probably from more than 100 different breeders. Well, nowadays when we talk about Asian discus, we mostly speak about fish that come from Malaysia, Thailand and Vietnam. That's probably the most widespread locations from where most of our Asian bred discus arrives. Well, there's also some discus farms in Indonesia, in Singapore and Taiwan, but we don't get normally in Europe and North America, we don't get too many fish from these sources, so most of the fish come from Malaysia or Thailand and Vietnam. And even when we talk about these three countries, there are hundreds of discus breeders in there of completely different grades. There are some really top level breeders which sell really expensive fish, and then there are cheaper breeders, so we never really know when we see that fish in a local fish store or online where exactly does it come from, which breeder it comes from. And when we talk about the local fish store, most likely this fish comes from some lower grade breeder, so that's probably not a very good quality fish. But let's get back to our question: can you mix Asian discus with other types of discus? Certainly you can. If you follow Asian breeders, some of the more famous Asian breeders on social media, you can see that they frequently import wild discus to create new strains, to mix blood, so to say. So there's a lot of wild discus genes in Asian bred discus, because it's frequently mixed with wild discus, which helps Asian breeders to create new strains all the time. That's why I would say that most Asian discus strains, they already have some wild discus blood in them, and it's quite safe to mix wild discus with Asian discus, or Asian discus from different sources. Again, I've done that before, and lots of other people have done that. You just need to follow the quarantine procedures and everything will work fine. So now let's get back to the hardest part of this problem, the European discus. Well, again, I don't really like this term European discus. In the United States, when they talk about European discus, they refer to Stenker discus, because that's pretty much the only type of European discus that is being exported to North America. In reality, there are also probably more than 100 different breeders across Europe, and even if we just talk about Germany, there are more than 30 breeders of discus. So Stenker is not the only European breeder in Europe. And in the UK, there are lots of discus from other breeders other than Stenker breeders that are sold in the UK. For example, you can find some French bred, Italian bred discus. Can you mix European non-Stenker discus with other types of discus? Well, definitely you can, because most of the smaller breeders and even relatively average sized breeders, not Stenker and not Pivovarsky, they mix their strains with Asian discus, they mix their strains with wild discus, so they have these working strains that always get some new blood added. And so that's why in most cases it is safe to mix European bred non-Stenker and non-Pivovarsky discus with discus from other sources, and I'm talking about Asian bred discus and wild discus. But unfortunately, most of the discus that we have available for sale, unless you're really searching for a European bred discus that is non-Stenker, most of the European discus that we have here in the UK and certainly in the North America and possibly also in Asia are Stenker discus. It's really hard to find non-Stenker discus, European bred non-Stenker discus. It's even really hard to find Pivovarsky discus. Well, most of the problem of mixing discus from different sources come when there's Stenker discus involved. To a certain degree, Stenker is correct when they say that it's better not to mix that discus with other discus from other sources. It is really hard to say why Stenker discus have such a low immunity and why they're so susceptible to diseases when mixed with discus from other sources. But my guess would be that Stenker rarely mix discus, or probably never mix. At least I have never heard about Stenker adding some wild discus to their strains or adding some Asian discus to their strains. So their strains are very solid and robust. They line breed their strains for many generations, so the strains that they have are very strong. What it means is that if you pick up two fish from the same strain, for example blue diamonds, and you breed them, it is likely that about 100% of their offspring will be blue diamonds. Or the same goes, for example, with German Wonder strain. It's the same. You would get probably more than 90% of their offspring looking exactly like their parents, which means that they have really robust strains. It's not the same with Asian discus, for example. You can pick up Asian discus from one strain, for example Altum Flora, and when you breed them you would only get about like 10 or 20% of their offspring looking like their parents, and you would get lots of other colors and mixture of colors among the rest of their brood. This is because the strains are, so to say, open for business, so you can really create new strains from existing strains. That's not exactly the case with Stenker, and I have previously bred Stenker discus. They're great fish, but I certainly know that their strains are very strong and you can line breed them. But that also probably means that they have low immunity because there's very little external influence on their strains, so they don't really add any fresh blood to their strains. Again, I might be wrong, but I couldn't find any information about stand care actually adding wild fish or Asian fish to strengthen their strains. So the fish kind of exist in this closed circuit system, and there's no new blood infusion. That's why probably their immunity is easily affected and compromised when they actually get in contact with discus from other sources. In my personal experience, I have mixed stand care discus with wild discus. I never mixed stand care discus with Asian discus, but I did mix successfully stand care discus with wild discus, and here you can see actually pictures of my blue diamonds, stand care blue diamonds, living happily with wild brown discus, and they've stayed in the same tank probably for almost a year, and there was no problems. Of course, both of these fish were quarantined before, and I've raised those stand cares from juveniles, and I've had wild discus for a really long time. So probably if these fish stay in your system for a while, if they stay in your system in completely different tanks, maybe for like a year or so, you can mix them up afterwards and there will be no problems. At least there was never any problem in my case when I mixed stand cares with wild discus. So to wrap up this video, which is already far too long, can you mix a discus from different sources? Yes, you can mix wild discus with other wild discus, with Asian discus. You can mix Asian discus from different sources, and you can also potentially mix stand cares with wild discus. At least I have done that before. I don't know if you can actually safely mix stand care discus with Asian bred discus, but I don't really know why would you want to do that in the first place. If you keep Asian bred discus, you really have a choice of probably hundreds of strains, all sorts of color variations. I don't know why would you want to add something from stand care to your Asian discus collection if you have the full color variation and all sorts of strains produced by Asian breeders. The same goes actually with stand cares. If you keep stand cares, you probably have like 25 or something like that strains of stand care discus, so there is really no need for you to add anything from Asian breeders. You might certainly want to add some wild blood to your stand care discus, which is what I was trying to do, and in my case it has worked well, and I had no issues with adding wild discus to stand care discus, so this is something you might consider. But other than that, I would probably be cautious of mixing Asian discus with stand care discus, again because stand cares have really low immunity. They don't handle well contacts with pathogens from other strains of discus, discus from different sources. Right, I hope this video was useful, and I hope I was able to at least shed some light to this issue. If you thought about this question and you didn't know how to move forward with this issue, I hope that I was able to at least clarify this situation. Leave your comments in the comment section if you have any experience of mixing discus from different sources, or if you have any questions, and I'll see you soon.